Every culture in human history has created monsters. Some lurk in forests, others beneath waves, waiting in caves or the liminal darkness we keep far away from. They have worn countless faces: dragons, demons, ghouls and ghosts, werewolves, sea serpents, and creatures whose names have long been forgotten. Yet despite these differences, there is a shared commonality to each one. They exist on the fringes of our light, threatening what we value and embodying that which we fear. Perhaps most interestingly, they often tell us far more about what lies within than any threat that lies without.
Myths and legend, history and hysteria, religion and the far reaches of the occult. These and more are the children of a common thing: belief, an intrinsic part of what makes us human. I'm your host, LiamLykos, an independent scholar of esoterica and eccentricities, a rational skeptic, father of two, writer, and lover of life. Pull up a chair, fellow lamplighters, and let us cast the shadows back a bit as we examine what lies beneath the light of Occam's lantern.
Welcome back, fellow lamplighters. Tonight, we will explore humanity's monsters, not to determine whether they're real, but to understand why we keep creating them. Before we begin, a few updates and notes. We've begun to advertise on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Facebook Reels, as well as Instagram and other channels. This is all done on a zero budget, so I appreciate any signal boosts out there. On a linear note, I've been looking for something short and punchy to help break up our longer bits. So if you have any products, ads, or personal businesses you'd like me to shout out during the breaks, let me know. Chances are I would be very interested in helping. Also, we've got a few guests lined up further down the road, which will make for some rather interesting episodes. More on that when we have further development to those projects. If you didn't get the chance, I implore you to go check out our previous episode, the first official storyteller session, a reading of Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft. I would like to hear your thoughts and suggestions on the episode, and next week I will have our second storyteller session queued up, where I will finally be reading my Daemonomicon entries, a series of short writings that embodied fictional retellings of some of the darkest points of my own psyche, an experiment in emotional purging through literature, something that should be quite interesting to see how it develops orally. Now, I've been receiving a lot of questions asking for closer looks and deeper dives into the subjects we've put on the table, and I know I say this during the episodes, but I also want to reiterate now. We are on episode 4, and most everything we've simply brushed over. There's a great chance that I'll be covering more in depth in later episodes that I will be dubbing Exploring the Deep. This episode in particular will have a few of those in the chamber, especially as we dive into horror media by the decade. I could easily do a full episode for each decade. All that out of the way, I believe it's time to dive into the episode proper, so pull your chair closer to the fire and let us begin. On December 21st, 1998, I was 13 years old, and Baldur's Gate, the classic tabletop-inspired computer role-playing game, was just released. A foundational CRPG that helped revive the genre from the blows dealt to it by the blossoming console market. The game opened with a singular quote: "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. For when you gaze into the abyss also gazes into you." It would be my first memory of coming into contact with the works of Nietzsche, and one that helped shape my mind into what it is today. The quote is from Aphorism 146 of Beyond Good and Evil, written by the philosopher in 1886. Fitting then that 140 years later, tonight we are gazing into that abyss, lantern in hand, ready to cast light and see if there's anything in the shadows returning our gaze. In episode 1, we examined what happens when belief runs rampant with fear. In episode 2, we cast light upon what happens when belief builds structure. Now, we see what happens when the structure built by belief is made from that very same fear, in a controlled and embraced manner. It is a fitting refrain of our theme that mankind's first monster was found in darkness, be it in the untamable hand of nature, predators in the underbush, plague, death, or even the hands and hatred of fellow man. There was much we could detect, catalog, remember, and much that we could not. But where we could not with our eyes and ears, our minds finished the job. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But what of the unseen deaths? The maulings by something that didn't quite match up with unknown predators, the murderous act blamed on anything but a fellow tribesman. Even before the French had their beast of Gévaudan, the terrors of mythologized stories rang true. But from whence did these fables arise? From where did the first tongue sing of a dragon? It's quite fascinating that most every culture has tales of giant serpents. The Norse, Mesopotamian, Chinese, Mesoamerican, entirely different cultures, but with the same monsters. Were there truly massive reptilians that hunted our ancestors, or was there a reason for these similar stories? As humanity huddled closer to the fires of civilization, a parallel to the development of ritual occurs. For more on that, please listen to episode 2, but it is here we see monsters become less overt and bestial, and more sinister and social. Ghosts and goblins that haunt the forests. Fables to tell children and the foolhardy not to wander far. Sea serpents and krakens, enforcing an eldritch respect for the very real dangers of the deep. In the witch, we see a dire instruction against the outsider, the other, and how trust of strangers can go mortally astray. In a way, some of these fictional monsters protected communities long before any written safety manuals ever existed. There exists an interesting milestone in which monsters were created for meaning rather than explanation. Less why and more what if. One of the earliest examples being in ancient Egypt, where amidst the anthropomorphic deities, given animal features to, among other reasons, enhance character traits often associated with those beings, owls and wisdoms, for example, we find the Sphinx, who served both symbolic and religious purpose. The creature functioned as a symbolic representation of power, wisdom, and kingship rather than a parable to keep people from dying. And even to this day, the Sphinx has found its position in our lexicon of fables. Unlike many monsters, the Sphinx did not exist to be vanquished, overcome, or avoided. Instead, it asks us to understand, to sharpen our wit and wisdom. The hero who encounters a dragon proves their courage through combat, but encountering a Sphinx proves their worth through wisdom. In this, we see a way of humanity encountering and overcome that often discussed oldest fear, the unknown, through knowledge. It's something we here at the Lantern can certainly appreciate. From disaster to dilemma, the evolution of monsters has countless examples, many of which we will no doubt again cover in later cultural and specific deep dives, but for now let us continue to examine the synchronicity of man's monsters with man's development. For as tribes became communities, became cultures, became structure, so too did dragons and serpents become giants and demigods. And as the meaning of evil changed, the monsters adapted as well. Angra known in later Persian as Ahriman, was one of the first definite forms of true moral evil. Not merely a troublesome god, trickster, or chaotic spirit, Ahriman was the embodiment of destructive forces. He was the shadow to the light of Ahura Mazda, a representation of truth, order, wisdom, and creation. And in these two, we see the beginning of a clear and definite cosmic duality, which would be paramount to the later Abrahamic mythology and many of the stories we tell to this day. One could convincingly say that Ahriman was a possible prototype to the devil himself. In this, we see a shift of thinking. What if the greatest threat wasn't merely outside our walls, but was an ever-present force of corruption itself? Monsters were now not only the thing that will eat you, but rather the behavior that will lead to destruction. Instead of forces of nature, monsters began to represent morality, temptation, sin, corruption, hubris. Increasingly, they became reflections of humanity's flaws. Demons and devils, Oni and Rakshasa, scapegoats for immorality, and sources of dread and means to curtail the thoughts and behaviors of those who would go against the common good, perceived or otherwise. Monsters began to come out of the darkness of the unknown and into the shadows of our psyche. In Greek mythology, we find Lycaon, who, in doubting the validity of Zeus, murdered another human, attempted to mix the flesh with the god's meal. Enraged in this affront, Zeus changed the man into a wolf, a curse to show his ferocity and hunger to all. In this we have one origin of the human-to-wolf transformations, and the origin of the word lycanthropy, from the Greek words for wolf and man. This Greek tale, dripping in the usual cultural tones of hubris and divine retribution, has endured and acted as foundation for European werewolf lore, laying the work for mythological retellings of the bounds between civilization and savagery. Behaving as a beast, he was thus made to forever be one. Ancient writers, from Pausanias to Pliny the Elder, record stories from Arcadia, the land of Lycaon, involving rituals where participants supposedly transformed into wolves. One in particular denotes a man whose transformation would last 9 years. Only the refrain from eating human flesh would return him to his natural form. The early cornerstones of the werewolf myth revolved around the loss of humanity. The scale of information and philosophy around lycanthropy will be covered in greater detail in later episodes, as I personally have written a few essays on the subject. But suffice to say, more modern knights would reframe these myths into a parable of repression and wantonness. Something more akin to Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, which leads to the gap from mythology to modernity, as fiction becomes a healthier and more thorough way to express, document, and purge our inner demons. The golden age of horror literature brought these to the forefront. As the previously mentioned, Jekyll and Hyde are joined by familiar compatriots, werewolves, vampires, Victor Frankenstein, and more. Narrative masterclasses that took the ideas of repression, human violence, social masks, and Jungian archetyping, and made them fabled monoliths that would become the cornerstones of iconic monsters of the modern world. Again, the subject of each ancient monster and its culture is something I would very much like to take the time to cover on individual episodes. But I wanted the scope of this episode to be a rather broad streak, embodying more of the philosophy of our monstrous creations, and the fascinating note that every century of history has had its own unique flavor of horror, reflected by the times. And when horror literature, and eventually media, became prevalent, each decade came with its own unique takes. And this is where things get really interesting. Something I would like to take more of a riff approach on, and any repeat listeners know where this is going. So tonight's episode is going to be skewed a bit differently, in that instead of being a tacked-on segment, we're going to be spending the majority of this episode inside the decompression chamber. Now, it wasn't until I began recording this episode that I realized that the year 1886 came up twice already. The first time being for the Nietzsche quote, and again for Jekyll and Hyde. And so I think that definitely the 1880s to 1890s should be our first decade to really do a look into. And in doing so, what were the fears of that time? Well, you had degeneration, urbanization, foreign influence, hidden vice. They were generally terrified that beneath the gentleman's suit lurked a beast, and that under the thin veneer of civilization there was something much, much darker. And this degeneracy took shape in these monsters that were sometimes very blatant, and sometimes a little bit more insidious. You know, we see the vampire in Dracula, this foreign invader, this hidden predator, corrupting influence, turning everything we love and hold dear against us, but not without its own hidden romance and deep ponderings. As much of that I attribute to Bram Stoker and his not entirely closeted romanticism. But cutting back to the effects of fear on culture and horror, we see these horrifying tales of that veneer chipping away. Things directly like Jekyll and Hyde, where you've got this picture of sophistication and erudite scholar who, to use a completely different term, werewolves out into this degenerate, lustful, hedonistic creature of pure desire. And, you know, you've got to figure a lot of the people at the time, did they secretly want to be this? Did their neighbor secretly want to be this? And so that's where that fear comes in. And meanwhile, you've got the older sophisticates, the blue bloods and whatnot, who were worried about that time ending, that sophistication drying up and becoming old and desiccate and dying somewhere in their attic, much like the picture of Dorian Gray. And as we move ahead 10 years into the 1900s, we see that the new fears are that of the unexplored world and ancient civilizations, cursed knowledge. The map wasn't completely filled in yet, and explorers are starting to uncover rooms and cultures unknown to Western audiences. People began to fear what might still be hidden beyond the horizon. And it's here that you get the first echoes of ancient curses and lost civilizations, primitive horrors in the monster world. Mummy stories, you know, the kind of first echoes of the Egyptomania, the beginning seeds of later weird fiction. And there's this kind of disregarding of fear when it comes to exploring these reaches after a while, because you see each victory, each conquest, each plumed depth as being a victory for rationalization, and technology continues to grow and develop, and there's these signs of hope until World War I comes along and shatters any and all assumptions about that progress. You know, technology was supposed to improve life, but instead produces machine guns, poison gas, and industrial slaughter. And so in the 1910s, the monster tropes of the day are artificial life, mechanized destruction, and mad scientists. We get Frankenstein, war fiction, and human progress becoming human destruction. And this kind of echoes throughout various decades as well. But the first real instance of this comes around in the 1910s. And after that pain settles in and the numbness starts to hit us, we enter the 1920s and begin to look around because the universe is suddenly much larger. Evolution, modern physics, astronomy, humanity is no longer at the center of creation, and the fear starts to become, what if we don't matter? And so in the 1920s, cosmic horror takes the forefront. Ancient gods, alien entities, forbidden knowledge. This is the prime year of Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard. The universe doesn't care about us. The monster isn't evil, it's indifferent. And this philosophical uncertainty of our place in the universe kind of held until you start to see economic collapse of the Great Depression and an altogether real uncertainty that washes away those fears of irrelevancy into actual action. And it's here that we are pounded over the head with uncertainty, collapse, broken dreams, and tragedy that monsters kind of take another stance. They begin to seem almost sympathetic. And that sympathy comes across in the silver screen when we finally get the universal horror films. Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, all classic tales that have been revised throughout the years to be certain, but in these film adaptations, we see these tragic monsters, and it's almost a reassurance that, we're not the only ones down on our luck. So are these mythic creatures and beings that we had forever shied away from. Well, now they're kind of holding up a mirror and allowing us to say, you know what? I feel bad too. And in those uncertain times, what we used to fear became almost a support. And unfortunately, that wouldn't last for very long. Because, well, next came the 40s. And as for what the fears and monsters and examples were for the 40s, well, there's a very big elephant with a very small mustache in the room. Real people became scarier than folklore. Fascism, war criminals, ideologues, humanity itself was the fear. And after the Holocaust, dragons and demons felt a lot less frightening. And it wasn't until a brilliant flash of inspiration in terror form and these mutant progenies of the nuclear annihilation that loomed on the horizon were mutants, giant insects, radioactive beasts, Godzilla. Oh yes. Science created monsters, and the atomic bomb gave us giant everything. And as horrific an incident it was, I feel like this was a just giant slap to the face to wake us up from the doldrums that we had fallen into as far as our creativity in terms of horror and fiction in general went. Suddenly these environmental horrors and fears of have we gone too far that you saw echoes of in previous decades suddenly went over the top, and as a result we got kaiju, which is one of my favorite forms of non-horror media indulgence. But let's move back to the discussion of the decades proper, and let's see, where were we in the 50s and into the 60s then? And oh boy, if the 40s and 50s were a sledgehammer to the human psyche, and the 50s began to rev up the theremin, The 60s really went subtle with the nauseating horror of paranoia and infiltration fears and herd conformity becoming this insidious conspiracy. We see things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where the monster isn't a giant creature or an insidious dictator or a zombie shambling through the night. It's something that looks exactly like you. Hell, it could be you looking in the mirror. The Cold War paranoia made everybody suspicious. McCarthyism, fear of ideological enemies. The question of the day wasn't what is the monster, it was who has already become a monster. And that festering paranoia was only fed more and more and more in past the 60s into the 70s as you had these spiritual reawakenings and an increased awareness of quote-unquote metaphysical and alternate religions, occultism. And so this fear of people who look just like us kind of took a more sinister turn because, well, here comes the devil. And you can go back and listen to our episode on the Satanic Panic to see exactly what kind of led more to this. As a matter of fact, I think that episode in general is a good point of reference as to what to expect for future deep dives into each of these decades in future episodes. But to reiterate, that paranoia that kind of burgeoned in the 60s met these newfound freedoms of expression, and all of the established status quo began digging for these demons and finding that the devil stopped living in the woods and has moved into the suburbs. Movies like The Exorcist, The Omen were natural reflections of religious decline colliding with spiritual uncertainty. People weren't worried that evil was hiding itself anymore, but that it was starting to be more open and that it was harder to recognize who the true evil was. And of course, it was also at this time that Anton LaVey in 1966 had founded and formed the Church of Satan, published the Satanic Bible in 1969, which had absolutely nothing to do with devil worship and evil, but instead used Satan and the scapegoat of the devil as a symbol of true freedom from indoctrination of religious thinking and restrictions placed by thou wilt and thou shalt, instead of simply, hey, don't be a dick. Of course, to the fearmongers and the people making these media sensations, they didn't care about what the truth was. They just cared about what it said on paper. And what it said on paper, well, that was enough to make money off of. And as far as what made money, well, if it bleeds, it leads, they always said. And this is a great stepping stone from the 70s into the 80s, when suddenly crime, serial killers, stranger danger was all over the market. And it was also this year, no coincidence, that we start to see slashers. Slashers and unstoppable killers, the icons, Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers. The monster was human. You weren't afraid of the crackling electricity and strikes of lightning on the castle up at the hill. You were afraid of the babysitter's phone ringing and what that might entail. Media sensationalism of serial killers made monsters the most realistically portrayed that they'd been in a while, but of course we had to take that and bump it up a notch because you could get enough of that on the news. And there were so many slasher films that went under the radar because they just didn't go big enough. And so that's why when you have the true groundbreaking like Michael Myers and later Freddy, Jason, they all had this iconic twist to them. They weren't just Jeffrey Dahmer. They were something with a much deeper, much more explorable evil that made it more palatable than what you would see on the news. But as the years rolled on, and, the Cold War ended, the apocalypse didn't happen, attention turned inward in the 90s, and the question suddenly became, what's wrong with us? And in such, you see a turn towards psychological horror, identity horror, internal corruption, things such as Seven, Silence of the Lambs, and I know it's not horror, but it definitely fits the bill here, Fight Club. The theme being, of course, internal demons, not external. And 90s prime horror was just fit with these points of, the call was coming from inside the psyche. And again, it seems like every time this introspective horror begins to take root, something comes along and shakes it all up. And in the year 2000... 2001 to be more exact, we have 9/11. And after that, the theme of horror switched on a dime. Suddenly, terrorism, pandemics, institutional distrust. We saw the rise of zombies, pandemic movies, societal breakdown, 28 Days Later, Dawn of the Dead remake, Resident Evil. This was the response to pure, real societal breakdown. And we're hot off of Y2K, and nothing happened. And so suddenly all of our creative minds, our mental facilities are saying, what if something did happen? What if something does happen? And in zombies, we kind of found this echo point of societal breakdown, as well as those past themes of degradation and werewolfing that we saw in Jekyll and Hyde, things like that, where suddenly the guy next door or little Tommy and Susie are these ravenous beasts that are going to ream us and tear us limb from limb and eat our livers. And it's a great example of how, as society becomes more introspective and starts seeing these brutalities more and more that we started seeing in the 70s and 80s on the news, on the media, our monsters become much more gruesome and much darker and much more extreme. But as we move into the 2010s, we're suddenly seeing more infrastructure, more stability, more surveillance, more of these old technological fears coming back. Social media, algorithms, isolation. This loss of privacy in and of itself became the monster du jour, as digital horror, surveillance, social contagion took off. And we see this in It Follows, especially in Black Mirror, that was literally made as a mirror held up to society and its fears of the future. And we also see some echoes of generational horror start to crop up. Movies like Hereditary kind of examining what exactly were our parents and their parents into, and the themes of reclaiming those old powers or those ancient secrets. Oof, that will be a delicious deep dive later. But the 2010s, we begin to see the monsters become less physical and more conceptual, a thread that continues onward to the modern times, 2020s, and that we see the return of cosmic dread in a form of analog horror. This look at the past with this general feeling of unease, because we are so retrospective and able to look back and able to see these patterns that the horror becomes that recognition. We see examples in the Mandela catalog, movies that almost have a divisive feel about them. Like, if you went through certain experiences, these movies would echo with you. But if you didn't, or if you didn't quite get it, it wasn't scary. Things like Skinamarink, analog horror series that some people can look at and be like, this looks like a bad VHS. But to others, it hits on a psychological level. And it all echoes the modern fear of polarization, artificial intelligence, information overload. Nobody agrees on reality anymore. And the modern monster isn't necessarily a creature, it's the uncertainty itself. And I kind of feel like there's an echo when it comes to the rise of the universal horror movie monsters that reframed those old horrors as something comforting. And then again with the slashers, when those first hit, those were terrifying. But now in the 20s, we're kind of seeing a reimagining of those. Not quite a reimagining, but an homage to them, and more feelings of nostalgia and a particulation of genre enjoyment that we see in this homage horror, such as Art the Clown, a reflection, a love letter to past slashers and decades-old gore flicks. It's as if the generations are always looking back, the first tricklings of mainstream total environment shaping as we want to immerse ourselves in something that is familiar and comfortable instead of being stranded in this morass of modern terror. We have this warmth, this cocoon almost of a total immersion environment, of being surrounded in the type of fear, horror, terror, bad things that we can recognize as being fake, as being false, as being stories, as being something that can pique those emotions and get us to express them in a safe environment and not have to worry about the consequences or who's got their fingers on the real life big red do not push button. And I kind of feel like that brings us full circle, because somewhere in humanity's distant past, monsters stopped being things we feared encountering and became the things we needed to tell stories about. The dragon, the giant, the beast in the forest, these creatures no longer existed merely to explain the unknown. They existed to test heroes, embody fears, and give shape to the struggles of the human condition. There is, however, a point to be made as the question shifts from what lurks in the darkness to what darkness lurks within us. Nietzsche's aphorism is arguably one of the clearest expressions of that transition. The true danger is not always the monster. Sometimes the danger is what prolonged contact with the monster does to the hunter. For thousands of years, humanity has filled the darkness with monsters. Some guarding rivers, others roaming haunted forests. Some embodied temptation, greed, or cruelty. Others reflected our deepest fears about ourselves. Yet, despite their countless forms, monsters serve a remarkably consistent purpose. They give shape to things that are otherwise difficult to confront. Fear, death, isolation, chaos, and the unknown. And perhaps that's why monsters never disappear. We do not create them because we believe they exist. We create them because the fears they represent do. The dragon may change, but the darkness remains. And with that, I believe we will wrap up this episode of Occam's Lantern. And I hope you join me next time as we read from my writings the Daemonomicon, followed by our next full-length episode, which will be our very first episode of Exploring the Deep, where we do our deep dive on the devil. the adversary, the trickster, and all iterations. Until then, keep the fire stoked and the lanterns full. This has been LiamLykos, and you've been listening to Occam's Lantern.